AJ, I tell you, mate, I am ready to get a crankin' on this podcast.
Sorry, just one sec. I've got to send a very important message.
All right. Well, I will, as has been, as we call in the industry, pad for time. So this is what we do, where we just kind of come up with random bullshit off the top of our head. Let's you and I, the listener, let's theorize what this message of AJ's could be. We just finished recording an episode of Home Improvement, so maybe it could be to his mysterious partner that he hasn't revealed much about, saying, "Hey, babe, just finished recording the podcast. Thinking of you. Now I've got to do another one." AJ.
That's actually a really good idea, and I should send that to my mysterious partner. But it is not what I sent, because, Richard, I've got no time for the people in my life. I've got to record a podcast about the Crank franchise, the Cranchise, if you will, called Film Franchise Fortnights on the Cult Pop Podcast, where we cover a different film franchise every fortnight. This year, of course, we're only doing duologies, that is, film franchises that only contain one film and a sequel, and so far this year, we've done Rio, we've done Speed, and now we're covering what could be argued as the platonic
combination
ideal between
of the
two. Which is, of course, the Crank duology, consisting of Crank and Crank High Voltage, a perfect middle of the Venn diagram between those two franchises, but I do think Speed is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that comparison. What is Rio doing in that comparison? There's a bird in
he's
one
the
of
only
them.
one of his kind.
Yeah. There you go.
There's no one else like Chev Chalios.
Death is imminent.
Yeah. All right. So, Crank came out in 2006, directed by Neville Dean / Taylor. Interesting.
Yeah,
It's a
so a couple of dudes, a couple of bros.
Couple of bros. They don't play by the rules. Mike Neville Dean and Brian Taylor. They made a couple other films. They also, same year as Crank High Voltage, they made Gamer, which I've never seen, but I had some friends who were really into it. And they also made Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, which I've also never seen, but for quite a while, Ghost Rider was my favorite movie of all time. And I never watched the second one. But they've now split off. They've made a bunch of other movies that I don't recognize by themselves. But the new Hellboy that is getting in trouble for maybe using AI, Brian Taylor's directing that.
Well, I think the reason they don't direct anymore, Richard, is because I don't think they're friends anymore. I don't think they're on speaking terms anymore, which if you've seen the Crank movies, you might be confused, because how could two men who clearly have such tolerance and respect for each other and respect for others flowing through their veins, how could they possibly have a falling out with each other? But that looks to be what has happened. I heard somewhere that they're not friends anymore, which is honestly the best thing that could happen to the future of the Crank franchise, I think.
The franchise.
So,
AJ, what is Crank about? It's got it's similar to like Speed. It's one of those sort of regularly memed premises. Yeah, and Rio.
I feel like I agree that Crank is becoming the premise of Crank is becoming a generic shorthand for it's Crank, but this when describing a new film or a new idea. But would you agree that I feel like the premise of Crank is vastly more well known than the movie itself? I feel like Crank as a film has sunk far more into obscurity, but its legacy as a movie with a succinct concept lives on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's
like how Totes My Goats is from I Love You, Man.
It's you're gonna have, but anyone referring to Crank knows of the film Crank. It's whether or not they've seen it, but it's not a film that people still talk about the film, but people still talk about the premise. But it is interesting that like you said, it's got the succinct premise, but it is essentially Speed, but with a human instead of a bus.
Yeah, what if it was a human body? So, Crank stars Jason Statham in a very Jason Statham role. He plays a hitman in the criminal underbelly of Los Angeles, who his name is Chev Chelios, and one day he wakes up from a daze to find that he has had a mysterious Chinese poison injected into his veins that will kill him within the hour unless he keeps his adrenaline levels high. So the movie is a high octane,
No holds barred.
No holds barred, Richard, I would even say. Action film about like this excruciatingly angry man who is doing everything he can, will stop at nothing to keep his adrenaline levels up so that his heart does not fail. It is a revenge film. He is chasing after the guy who poisoned him. The reason he was poisoned is because it's believed that he carried out a hit on this very powerful figure in this criminal underbelly. It is revealed somewhat at the start of the third act that he actually didn't kill him. The movie is just sort of basically a bunch of
the shit that
vignettes.
For those playing at home, none of the shit that AJ just said actually matters after he needs to keep producing adrenaline. None of the shit matters.
Yeah. None of the shit matters. Right.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned it's a very Jason Statham-y role, but AJ, if you can tell me who the script was written for, well, do you know already who the script was written for?
I actually don't. I'm sure we'll get into this. I'm sure I knew at one point, but I don't have it on my mind.
If you can tell me, I will send you a CD of Dane Rumble's The Experiment.
Wow. Is this a hint that it was Dane Rumble, that the role of
it was written for Dane Rumble at the height of his Fast Crew fame. No, the script was written in 2003. Yeah, who would you guess?
I would guess, based on what Neville Dean / Taylor went on to do, could this be a Nicolas Cage vehicle?
That's a very good guess. You're not going to get the CD because it's not who exactly I had in mind, but Nicolas Cage was offered the role, but had to turn it down due to scheduling conflicts. And then, it was given to Jason Statham. He was like, "Oh, but I'm not funny." And they were like, "No, you don't have to be funny. You just let the script be funny." And then in the second one, they lean into his Britishisms a lot more because it was written for him. But no, the script was written for Johnny Knoxville.
Interesting. I think that Jason Statham, for all this movie's flaws, is probably the best thing about this movie. So I think that the stars aligned in this case for Crank 1.
So it's got a lot of famous fans. Like, a lot of people grew up on this movie and love this movie for various reasons. Seth Rogen, Rupert Grint, Simon Pegg, James McAvoy, Edgar Wright, and Gareth Evans have all sung the praises of this film, calling it their favourite Jason Statham film. And
I like how you said that they've grown up on it and then named a series of adult men that were adults in 2006.
Yeah. But what do you think is the general consensus on this film, AJ? What do you think it has on Rotten Tomatoes?
On Rotten Tomatoes, this will be like mid-70s. I don't think it's too negative.
It's 62%, so it is technically fresh. It's above 60 is considered a good film.
The best kind of fresh. Fresh, it's as fresh as the almond milk in my fridge.
Yeah. Imagine going over someone's house and be like, "Is this milk fresh?" Technically,
it's fresh. Yeah. So yeah, this is Crank. This is
You grew up on this film.
This is going to be. I grew up on this film somewhat. So I think that this is going to be a very interesting discussion to have, Richard, because I'll get something out of the way right up top. This movie has aged atrociously, and this is the Cult Popture podcast. We talk about this shit semi-regularly. I think it's become kind of like a cornerstone of our brand, is talking about
a problematic cornerstone.
Very good. But this one has a distinction, and what I think is a very comparable franchise to Crank, in multiple ways. One very obvious way and one less obvious way. I think this is very comparable to when we covered the Butterfly Effect trilogy last year, because both are movies. They both have Amy Smart in it. No, both are movies that when I first saw them, I was like, "Oh my God, I understand cinema now. Like, this is what true filmmaking is." But in the case of both movies, as we'll come to it, I now like very much look down upon these movies and see them as not quite as clever or smart as I once thought they were. But the difference here, Richard, is that I had that realization about the butterfly effect before we started this podcast, right? Like just out of high school, early 20s, I sort of revisited the butterfly effect and was like, this is actually pretty bad. Realizing that Crank is not a good movie happened 2 days ago when I rewatched Crank for the first time in 10 years for this podcast. Because, Richard, I think I have seen Crank. It's up there as one of the movies I've seen the most times in my life, because I had a friend in high school when I first saw this movie. I bought this on DVD from the warehouse bargain bin for $10 after catching it on TV, I think, at some point. I used to watch this movie regularly with a friend of mine who would come over for sleepovers and only want to watch Crank or Yes Man, because I had those two movies on DVD, and he would only want to watch
Yes Man was like 2009,
one of those two.
Wasn't it? So this is a few years after Crank.
Correct. And I later found out that he was also stealing my mum's prescription drugs, which was also part of the reason he wanted to come over so often.
Very Crank of him.
But he really wanted to always watch Crank all the time. And I think if I was to make sort of a Rio speed comparison between Yes Man and Crank, I would say both movies have kind of depraved sex scenes in them, which I think may have been
when he fucks the old lady.
And Yes Man, not in Crank.
Although Amy Smart's not getting any younger, that's what I was thinking.
If you told me in Crank that there's a scene I'd forgotten where he fucks an old lady, I'd be like, yeah, probably. I'm not going to fight you on that. But no, listen. Here's what I used to say about Crank up until 2 days ago when I rewatched it. This is what I was planning to come to the podcast with,
sure.
Right? I was going to characterize Crank as like, this is a movie where on the surface it looks like a super dumb, mindless action film. But if you actually watch it and you actually sit down with it, you will discover that it is incredibly smart. It is incredibly experimental filmmaking. It is like there are things in this movie that don't need to be like there are so many weird scenes in this movie. Like there's a bit where he gets into an elevator at the start of the third act, and a man in the elevator starts speaking to him as all these various people in his life. There's there's weird.
And
there's
he can
a weird
see the subtitles.
He can see stuff like that, right? Like these avant-garde things, which at the time when I first saw this movie would have been around the same time that I saw Fight Club, which does a lot of these things as well. And so I thought this is what smart filmmaking is. It's putting these metatextual, weird avant-garde moments in it, and like these things that might not be to everyone's taste, but that's what makes it such a good movie. Richard, now I'm watching this movie as a 30-year-old man, and I'm thinking...
You're 31, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
No, you're not 31 yet.
I'm watching this movie, and I'm thinking 31. To myself, this is not very clever, because the comparison to Fight Club doesn't really work, because I think Fight Club was fairly innovative with these things, and also, goes without saying, but Fight Club's message is very smart and strong and
Fight Club's a good movie.
Intellectual. Fight Club's a good movie, whereas like what I used to see in Crank as like these really genius creative moments that didn't need to, movies that it's based on like speed, that's just a generic, we follow the story, there's nothing weird happening in Speed. But now I see the stuff in Crank as very derivative and pretty much the equivalent of like, if when I was 15, I tried to make a smart movie.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I wrote down a certain specific comparison that I wanted to draw between to try and articulate how I feel about this movie right now. And I wrote down this. I said, say if Fight Club was a decadent roast chicken, I thought Crank was secretly also a roast chicken, but everyone just wrote it off as being a big bag of Doritos, right? But it's not, idiots. It's actually a really smart, also a roast chicken. Watching it now, I'm discovering that it's actually just Doritos, like the Mountain Dew flavor of Doritos. It's weird, and it is experimental, but it's still a fucking pack of Doritos. And that's without
with
even getting
sugar on
into, like... Yeah. It is a dumb movie dressed up like a smart movie that you need to maybe not be 15 to realize that it's dressed up that way.
You often use food as a metaphor, and it's so funny because 90% of the time I'm like, AJ, what the hell are you talking about? Like, why... like, why a roast chicken? And you're like, yeah, it's this beautiful roast chicken. And then I thought it's also a roast. I know, you're like, but it's not a roast chicken. It's Doritos, and it's like, I don't think of Doritos and roast chicken as being on the same scale. Like you should have said it's like roast chicken flavored Doritos or something like that. But it's like. Yeah,
I'm so proud of writing that down. I was like, this is going to slay. This is going to kill. But much like Crank, it really didn't work out on execution.
Yeah, I mean, this is my first time seeing Crank. I went into this expecting to quite like it. Like, I knew it had this reputation as this, like, balls to the wall, just, like, insane thing. I fucking hated this movie. I thought it was so bad. I enjoyed...
And let me tell you that threw me off so much that, like, I didn't... Like, I was watching it, and then I had to pause it. I went to sleep and watched the rest the next day. In between me being halfway through it, you messaged me saying, I actually thought that was, like, fucking abysmal. Yeah. And I was like, oh... Is it? Because I was kind of enjoying the nostalgia of it all and things like that. And then I sort of watched the second half with this new lens of like, maybe this isn't as smart as I thought it was. And then
Richard
went to log it on Letterboxd. And like, this is a pretty like favorable average score on Letterboxd.
I get why it does. And especially that like with our contemporaries, I can understand if you grew up on these films. You know, that I'm not going to try to take that away from you because similar to like there is a time in my life where I could have watched this and it would have made me fall in love with filmmaking because of all the same sort of things you said. I hate, okay, so some of this film is just like the most fucking in your face, obnoxious, detestable the way it's shot. I fucking hate it, and all the little effects it does, and the Google Maps, like, and it has the Google logo on it. Hate all that shit, but I hate also how much I love some of the vibe of it. That like the whole thing's shot on like camcorders, and I kind of really dig that. Like a lot of the film was shot because it was like the two directors with the DOPs and they ran the A and the B camera, so one of them would be getting close-ups, one of them would be getting wide shots, and they would be like racing around town on roller skates with just like a little digital camcorder like you might have had in 2006. I also just hiccuped there, which brings me to the other thing that I really liked about the movie, is that the one, so I read this on IMDb as just being a happy accident, but when Jason Statham picks up his partner, Amy Smart, Candy, and he explains...
No, Eve, her name is. Candy's a stripper name, I think, in the second film.
Well, I watched the second film more recently. He picks up Amy Smart anyway. And he says, and he explains, I'm actually a hitman. I don't work in whatever I told you I was working in. And I've got this poison in me.
He says a video game designer, which
that's
is
what
very
I thought,
pointed. Yeah.
Well, then they went on to make Gamer as well. So, but he says, anyway, I've got that dog in me, and the dog is trying to, I need to keep producing adrenaline. And the whole time he's telling her this, she has the hiccups, which is apparently Amy Smart just had the hiccups, and they were like, yep, sweet. Which, if you're like, making a film and an actor has the hiccups, you don't just go, oh cool, we'll film it anyway. That's an insane thing to do. But my god, it is the best creative decision in the entire film. Like, Amy Smart is adorable, and she's and it's just like it just adds this like distracted nature to what he's like, and also just this like annoying thing. I've tried to podcast with you when you've pretended to have the hiccups when we did the Hangover.
I wasn't pretending. Why would I pretend? Why would I pretend?
Because you're such a big Crank fan, and you thought, oh, this would be a great creative decision. But they like it's so frustrating when you're just trying to articulate something to someone and they just pretend to have the hiccups. So like, yeah, I don't know. It just that was my favorite part of the film because, yeah, it's great.
Yeah, okay, I understand. I think that like, where was I going with this? Hold on, cut this out. I didn't really have a segue. I was just like,
well, AJ, I think I might
to
know where you were going, and that's to a little place that we haven't visited in quite a long time, the Problematic Corner.
Oh, no.
And this is the first time we've done the Problematic Corner since I've been editing. So, AJ, I will need you to send me the theme song.
I don't know if I have it still. You're gonna have to ask Carlisle.
Ooh, I bet this didn't age well. Let's get a laugh at someone else's expense. I have to warn you, this might get obscene. This the Problematic Corner where ain't nothing PC.
All right, so there is a lot of
is this going to be the rest of the episode? Is going to be in the Problematic Corner?
Yeah. Well, there's so there's a lot of stuff that are just like they use slurs. There's like dated depictions of like gay characters, trans people, all these kind of things that you just expect from like a no holds barred action film from 2006, made by
directed by two frat boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff, yeah, like it's par for the course a little bit, and won't. There's no point dwelling on it too much. But one thing that I do want to talk about is that there is like a sex scene in this film, which I think is like quite an iconic sex scene. I've seen people talk about it, and the kind of thing that it's like. I've seen people on Reddit, that it's like it awakens something in them because it is this like it explores a lot of different kinks, I'll say. So he's explained to Amy Smart, I need to keep my adrenaline pumping. I need to keep, my heart rate up. And he's like, wait a second. I know a way I can do that. Have sex with me right here in the middle of, they're in like Chinatown. And he starts to drag her and pull her unwillingly into this sexual entanglement, and at first, she's fully not into it. It's you're like, oh, am I going to just be watching a rape scene? But then, because he's so good at sexual intercourse, she gets won over by it, and then there's also this voyeuristic element where they end up just banging in front of everyone, and she has a sorry Amy Smart fans, but she is it's a body double, her nudity in this, and her body double gave an interview about it, and apparently Jason Statham made her feel very comfortable, and he said, don't worry about it, I got you, love. And then he didn't make me feel stupid or naked.
Sweet.
I had to be completely topless. And there was this crazy scene outside with all these background actors. But I was like, this is not a bad day. I'm taking my clothes off for Jason Statham. I'll be okay today. And she got the call for Crank 2. Amy Smart specifically requested her. And she thought that was really sweet. But she was pregnant at the time and couldn't do it. I was so upset. But you can't be a pregnant body double. It's a liability. So there's a little bit of niceness in the Problematic Corner. But AJ, did you have anything you want to say about the sex scene? Because it's one of those things that I was aware of before having seen the movie. There's a similar sort of public sex scene in the second one as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the sex scene feels like it's a microcosm for the whole franchise, I think, because I'm not going to say anything mind-blowing here, but it's like, this is so male-gazy. This entire franchise is so male-gazy, and it's not the kind of male gaze that is like it feels self-aware but unself-aware at the same time.
Yeah.
Like what I mean by that is like, they don't seem to be aware of how like repugnant these ways of depicting certain things are, but they also are self-aware enough to be like, here is a dedicated crash zoom in on some boobs because we like boobs and we want to objectify women with our audience.
This film is for people who also like boobs. But I think the thing, that like you said, like being a microcosm for the whole thing, that it's like, even the sex. So like this whole film is like, if you're 14, this film fucking rocks. I get that.
It
And
did.
even
I can confirm.
yeah, like the sex scene in the film is like the hottest thing ever if you're 14, because the idea of like coercing a woman into sex, but winning her over because you're so good at sex is the kind of shit that, like, before you've actually had sex or spoken to a woman for that matter, the kind of thing that you think, maybe I'll do that one day because I'll be real good at sex. But it's like,
it's self-aggrandizing and very like, I don't know. It's just it's a dangerous, like, ultimately, what is the problem when we say problematic, right? And I think that what it is here is like, it is telling the impressionable teenage audience that are likely to see this R18 movie that, like, this is the male power fantasy that you can achieve. And it's what, like you say, when you're uneducated, it seems great. And to my friend who was stealing drugs off my mum, like, yeah, like, I'm sure he loved that about it. But like, it's so damaging. It makes me so sad to watch it now and be like, if this was being depicted in pop culture in 2006, and it's on such a ridiculous grand scale, and like, I was a teenager, so like, I was never going to be like in a situation which would even look like this remotely. But it's like, if this is what is okay to say is okay in the movies, then imagine like the real world versions of shit like this, right? Like this is a great example of why conversations around consent started to become so prominent in the 2010s, right? Because it's movies like this and American Pie and other things that we've covered on this podcast that like put the men first in the conversation about sex and consent. And yeah, it made me so sad to watch it this time. And what's funny is in the second film, which by and large doubles down on everything problematic about the first film. Like, it is a way more offensive film than the first film, I think. But the sex scene in it that is deliberately, it's another public sex scene with Amy Smart that's deliberately calling back to this one. That is her idea in that film. So say what you want about Crank High Voltage, but the sex scene is consensual in that one, whereas in this one it's coerced.
Yeah, but it, like, it's funny, all the stuff you're saying about like the real world. It is shocking to learn that the set was a good place for body double Laura Grady.
Yeah. Exactly.
Got a piece of dumb IMDb trivia for you as we move out of problematic corner.
Tell me.
Writers and directors Mark Neville-Dean and Brian Taylor never acknowledged that Run, Roll, Lola, Run, in particular its visual style, may had influenced the film.
Interesting. Was this written by the director of Run, Roller, Run? They never acknowledged that maybe my work had something to do with it.
Yeah, clearly a fan, but it's like, okay, yeah. No.
Yeah, no mention of speed, no mention of like any, you know, like this movie, I've been over this, but it's derivative as fuck. Like, the only thing original about it is like its premise, basically, and then that's squandered on creepy sex scenes.
Yeah, that's funny. The I spoke about this before, the film Guns Akimbo, but it's like, I never, until now, I didn't have Crank as like a reference point, but oh my god, Guns Akimbo is like the worst person you know watched Crank and thought, fuck yeah, I can do that, but more. And it's, I always
want to watch Guns Akimbo.
Compared it to like an Edgar Wright film or something, but yeah, it's just like, oh, Guns Akimbo is just the most obnoxious fucking film, but there is a generation of people that are currently growing up with Guns Akimbo and aren't going to realize for another decade that it's terrible.
In watching it this time, and this is true of both films, the one thing that I still think is really good across the board is the marriage of the characters and the acting. I think this is similar to how I feel about Joker, in that Joker is a movie where everything's 10 out of 10 except for the director, which is like a 2 out of 10. And so like it looks like a really good movie, but if you actually stop to like analyze it, I feel like it's quite shallow and empty and
shallow and pedantic.
Bad faith, right? Yeah. And this is the same thing, more or less. I think there's a lot more worse than, like, Joker's various crafts are a lot better.
Joker is better than Crank, I'll say it.
I'll say it. But I think, as I said before, I think Jason Statham is, like, excellent in this. I think he's so fun and interesting to watch. But, like, furthermore, every side character, like, these films are chock full of secondary characters. And they are all super gross, super interesting, really, like, earnestly performed. And I think
David Carradine and Yellowface in the second one.
Yes. It is a film that is, like, going so fervently into the, like, it's essentially GTA, it's essentially a Grand Theft Auto movie, that, like, it really gets that part right, that the best thing about Grand Theft Auto is probably the characters, right? Like, it's these really idiosyncratic, gross, violent people, and Crank's cast is, in both films, is enough to sustain a further sequels, I would think. Like, there's plenty to
you've answered your own franchise.
There we go.
That's funny. I also used the word fervently today, and similar to, I'm sure, how you felt, was 90% sure that I used it correctly.
I used to have the ringtone from this film was my ringtone. That's how much I was into this when I was like 18. And if you haven't seen it, the ringtone that whenever someone's calling Chev in this film, because he's like fading and dying every second he's not moving, it's like sort of your typical phone ring, digital phone ring sound effect, but it's like, it sounds like it's slowing down. So it's like, and that was my ringtone for a while.
Nice. So, 3 years later, Crank High Voltage came out. Did you see it in the cinema, AJ?
Buddy, I bought it on DVD when it came out in New Zealand, because this did not play in cinemas in New Zealand.
Very good, AJ. That was, in New Zealand it was straight to
but
DVD.
Like, it was literally like, I looked it up, waited for the day it would come out, bought it the day it released, because I was so excited for Crank High Voltage.
Same directors. What do you think this one has on Rotten Tomatoes? First one at 62.
See, I would have also said this would be quite low, and I think it will be, but again, it's Letterboxd general reception, bafflingly positive. But I'm going to guess this is in the, like, low 40s on Rotten Tomatoes.
65, it's higher than the first one.
What? That is mind-blowing. How did I not know that? Like, interesting. Wow. I see what I always
I'll give it that it's a fairly
film.
consistent franchise.
Is it a Gold Star franchise?
It might be. I don't think either of them are good in the slightest, but
that's not what a Gold Star means, though.
I know.
But I always remembered this one because I was disappointed by it, and this was in the burning embers of when you'd watch special features on your DVDs. Like, we're talking like end of the 2010s, or no, start of the 2010s. Sorry, where like that was still like a pastime with your friends, was to watch special features on a DVD. And I've seen the special features for both Crank DVDs, and there's this interview I remember with Neville Dean / Taylor where they're sitting in this dark room drinking beers like a couple of fucking bros, and one of them is talking about a comparison between the first two films, and he specifically goes, but I do think High Voltage is the superior film. And I remember thinking, you fucking idiot, this movie's nowhere near as good as the bastion of creativity that is Crank 1. Yeah. Watching this one again now, as I say, it's a lot more offensive than the first one. The first one's not like squeaky clean in the racism department, but for some reason in this one, they just have Chev Chelios like regularly shout slurs at people of other races. And
give me some examples of slurs.
No, but if the main character is calling, a Chinese man a very famous Chinese slur, then it does make you think. Then it does make you think that the directors themselves are probably okay with and maybe even condone this kind of language, which the undercurrent of this whole podcast, I think, has me been wanting to acknowledge that I think Neville Dean and Taylor are bad dudes, man. Like only grotesque, ugly, horrible people can make a movie like this, even if it's enjoyable by some measurements. This is grotesque,
horrible people.
Let me put it this way, Richard. In Crank High Voltage, Chev Chelios isn't the only thing that is heartless, because I think the filmmakers are very heartless too.
Nice. Were you trying to be funny just then?
No. He gets his heart taken out in this one. So at the end of
it's
Crank
not even a
1,
reference to this podcast. I'm sorry.
At the end of Crank 1, he falls out of a helicopter and calls Eve on the phone and leaves a message, and then he smashes into a car and bounces and hits on the road, and the last second you see him blink, and it's always like, oh my god, he survived. And in the second one, it's revealed that he was scooped up by like the Chinese mafia, who replaced his heart with a car battery because the events of Crank 1 sort of like made the heart of Chev Chelios this legendary MacGuffin. And so instead of adrenaline, sorry everyone, instead of adrenaline, it's electricity. That's the plot of Crank 2, is that he has to electrocute himself to survive through the events of the film. He does
9 times throughout the movie.
And somehow they make like a public sex scene necessary, even though
because if he can generate enough friction, that counts as a charge.
Yeah. This movie's so grotesque, man. It is so sleazy. That's the word I'm looking for. This one is so much sleazier than the first one, which is already a very sleazy movie.
Already probably the sleaziest film I'd seen up until that point.
Yeah. And like there's a bit in the one of the better characters, or one of the more interesting characters in the Crank franchise is this like depraved doctor that he's always calling on the phone to help him out. He's like this,
who's just
this
like
corrupt
rubbing this woman's booty the whole time, and there's lots of close-ups of the booty.
That's what I was going to say. Like, I remember just how smoky and sexual and gross the creative choice was to focus on his hand like pinching her butt cheek as he's like describing something on the phone. And it is a film that is so obsessed with sexualizing every woman in the film, every person. Even there's an old lady in this film who is like a bystander who Chev tries to like create friction on by rubbing up against, and then later she's being interviewed on the news where she's talking about her experience and talks about how sexy it was, right? Like there is not a woman in these films that talks like how women talk in real life. They all talk like they're written by men. But what I thought was also interesting in this film is and you know, maybe this is fair play, but it's also very obsessed with dicks, way more than the first one. There is so much penis in Crank High Voltage. There's so much more, like there's
Crank.
what we'd now label as sexual assault is depicted in this, but it happens to men this time, so it's fine, yay! Like, and it's like, what are you supposed to do when the guy that the movie has told you is like the protagonist who you're supposed to invest in? He's like, and trigger warning for sexual assault on male characters here. At the start of the film, he shoves a shotgun up a guy's ass to get information out of him. And you know, it's 2009, so this is treated like a fuck yeah, I'd do that if I was in his shoes. That's such a badass cool thing to do in an action movie.
It's also that thing of like the worst thing that can happen to a man is to have a foreign object in his
something
anus.
vaguely gay. And yeah, so like this would be an interesting movie to study from like a Freudian perspective. And it made me think that maybe the reason Neville Dean Taylor are no longer Neville Dean / Taylor, but are now just Neville Dean, and also Taylor, is maybe there was a little bit of Neville Dean / Taylor going on, if you know what I mean. I think these dudes wanted to fuck each other so bad that the only way that these feelings could exert themselves was by making this like depraved, horribly homophobic, horribly toxic.
Well, the only reason to be homophobic is because you're a closeted gay. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Also hated this film. Obviously, you had a lot of the first one had a lot of fans though, because a lot of cameos in this film randomly. Chester Bennington is in the first film. He tells Chester Bennington, former lead singer of Linkin Park. He tells him about the nasal spray in the first one, and then he's also in the second one. But yeah, like Maynard James Keenan from Tool plays this, and here's the joke, gay guy.
Yeah, just a guy.
Yeah. Just plays like a very buttoned down random guy. But yeah, there's also there's a member of Nine Inch Nails in it. There's Ron Jeremy's in it, along with a bunch of other porn stars. Ron Jeremy, just because they filmed this porn stars strike, and it's all like real porn stars. You might have even recognized a couple of them, AJ. But apparently he just found out about this
from the dozens of times I've seen Crank 2. Of course, I recognize.
But yeah, he heard about this, assumed that they forgot to call him, and just showed up.
Ron Jeremy.
Yeah, what a guy.
What's not to love about that? Probably the most problematic aspect of this film is that Ron Jeremy appears in it.
But yeah, I mean, it's a film randomly filled with cameos, which I guess speaks to the success of the first one, I guess. Like, you wouldn't do that if the first one bombed and people hated it.
Yeah. This one ends with him setting himself on fire by grabbing like an electrical outlet so that he can defeat the villain from the first film, guys, who get this as being kept alive. We thought he was dead, but he's being kept alive as a head floating in a jar, or in a tank rather. And when I was 17, 18 and I saw this film for the first time, my feeling, this is so funny, one of the reasons I didn't like it was because I thought it went too unrealistic. Like, it wasn't as grounded as the first film. Like, I thought it made stupider, like it was being silly, whereas the first film was secretly quite a serious movie.
Yeah. It's funny that the directors originally refused to make this film because they were like, no, we killed off Chev at the end of the first one, presumably ignoring the final shot of the film where he's revealed to be alive, and also the footage that plays during the credits of them keeping him alive. But according to, get this, producer Skip Williamson. Do you recognize that name?
Yeah, we've got a guy in our Discord who goes by Skippy Williamson.
Yeah. I know not to dox you, Skippy, but Ben is your name a reference to Crank producer Skip Williamson.
I have a feeling maybe Skip Williamson has produced more notable works than Crank 2.
Not really.
Okay, well, fuck it. Maybe that's who Ben's referencing with his Discord name. Let us know, Ben.
Skip Williamson, producer. Yeah, he made the Underworld franchise, Napoleon Dynamite, Gamer.
These are pretty big movies. You were like, nah, he hasn't done anything else of notable, like, quality, and then you named two franchises more notable than both Crank films combined.
Yeah, but also it's not like, well, they're not more highbrow than... I mean, he did also do Little Miss Sunshine and $1 Million Baby, but... but yeah, he... The director said, no, we'll just write it, and then they ended up falling in love with the finished script and said, no one else could do it better than us, so they signed on.
And maybe they were right, Yeah, that doesn't mean it's good, though.
Who else could have done this in the way that they intended? Yeah, no bits of this film stuck out to me as being things I enjoyed. I thought it was pretty bad on the whole. I will say I thought it was worse than the first one because the first one had one creative decision that I liked.
This film also, and I know this from watching the special features 15 years ago, this film they patented a camera rig in this film. Oh, yeah. So they, as you said, in the first one, they were on roller skates. In this one, they got roller skates as well and got a bunch of cameras connecting in sort of like an arc shape and would skate backwards so that they could film someone running from 8 different, slightly different angles. So it could go around them, and there's a special feature on how they patented this rig and all this sort of thing. The other great thing,
very similar to the thing used for the bullet time sequence.
Probably derivative of that, to be honest. The other thing I remember from the special features of Crank 2 is there's a bit where they're filming the bit where the guy from Tool is in it, and like someone, like a bystander, walks on set or something, and they're like, "Hey, we're filming it," and then Jason Statham yells at top volume, "We're making a movie!" And it's the funniest thing I've ever heard. It's so much funnier than anything that's actually in the movie.
Well, there's also the other, because I remember you telling me that there's 2 Jason Statham lines that you love, and
yes, the other one's in Crank 1 where he's on the phone to the
technically
bad guy.
what you told me is a misquote, but it still works.
Well, in the actual movie, he says like, "Don't pop a." So yeah, he's antagonizing the villain, and when the villain like gets angry with him, he goes, "Don't pop a blood vessel, you little penis." Which I always loved the idea of calling someone a little penis. He's not saying that this character has a little penis. He's just calling him a little penis.
He is the manifestation of a little penis. But yeah, and we're making a
very
movie.
Great stuff.
Great stuff. Anyway, that's the franchise. There is, it's funny, like I had a look at, I googled what should the gimmick be for Crank 3, because it's been like a Reddit thread from time to time, and you know, people, it's the kind of thing that, oh, he has to have dairy, or whatever.
That's the thing. I have never heard a good, not even like a passable idea for what the gimmick of Crank 3 should be.
Yeah, well, we'll pitch ours in just a moment, but I just want to, there was talk of a third film. Amy Smart said it's been talked about. Also said that it might be made in 3D, which of course it would, and it's kind of one of those things that it's like, this is the kind of movie that should have been made in 3D, and by you know, there's an argument made for that. Brian Taylor did an AMA on Reddit, and he said Crank 3 probably come out in 2013, which is 11 years ago. It didn't happen. March 2015, Statham said he'd love to do it, and he was waiting for them to get their heads together. And then he said they've got a loose idea, they haven't got the script. In 2018, Brian Taylor said it would be a while until there was a Crank 3 due to profitability concerns and high expectations, and that's the last we've heard of it.
And do you know what as well? It's expired. This is a good thing, but you can't make a movie like this anymore.
Yeah.
Like it reminded me of, like, one thing I thought that was interesting about the TED TV series is that I talked about this when we covered it on the Patreon show, that like it invites
just got a season 2 announced, baby.
It invites people to go back and watch the original TED movies, which if I was Seth MacFarlane, I would not want people revisiting. And I think if you were to make a Crank 3 now, the problem is A, it would make people revisit these like atrocious, like heartless, scuzzy movies you made 20 years ago. But it would also like, it's also just, you can't, you would not be able to keep the spirit of Crank alive by today's like standards of what's okay to depict,
in this sort of woke media.
In this woke media economy. But what I'm saying is that like, therefore, what's the point? Because if to me, the DNA of Crank is that it's problematic. And that is not to say they should make a problematic third film. It's that they should bury these movies in the desert and distance themselves from them ever existing, I think.
My continue to the franchise is... It's actually, I went through a few different stages because I was thinking about that, like, there is like a video game, but it's not like a real, you know, AAA title or anything like that. But it obviously seems very suited to a video game. But then I was thinking about it, and it's like, I actually have like, I would have like no interest in a game based on Crank High Voltage's gimmick. That it's like the idea of, oh, you just have to collect batteries. Like, oh, okay, who gives a shit? But then a video game based around Crank's gimmick is actually quite interesting. And I thought of the idea of being more around like, because it's the kind of thing you could just have little cocaine packets that are around and you just have to keep finding those, and you know you've got a meter that you have to keep above a certain thing. But like I like the idea of it being more like almost like a puzzle game, that it's like you have to achieve this goal and do things in a certain order to keep your adrenaline at a certain level. But whereas I don't know, keeping your adrenaline up and doing things like, oh shit, I'm running out of time, I'll jump off this building and not pull my parachute till the last second, you know? Like, but
Great
if it's
idea,
just
yeah.
collect batteries, collect shocks, that's boring. But then I was thinking about, because I was like, yeah, well, that interests me more. But then I was thinking about, like, if it was to be a film, I'm actually kind of more interested, especially, you know, after the first two films, in the reverse of Crank 1's gimmick, that this guy has to go
He has
on
to
this...
stay calm.
He has to stay calm on this mission of revenge, which is essentially the Hulk, but he'll die rather than Hulk out if he goes above. But yeah, like, going through remaking Crank 1, he has to do all the same shit, but he's never allowed to go above, like, a light jog, and he's never allowed to do anything too exciting.
Yeah. Richard, we have a film franchise Fortnights first here, because in the past we've played to continue the franchise, and we've pitched each other's idea, you know, that we both independently came up with. But it's never happened twice, which is what just happened right now. I had an idea of a Crank video game, which I was basically going to describe in more or less the same way you did, and then I had a backup idea of what if it's the opposite, which now that I'm saying out loud, they're kind of logical conclusions to come to when you're spitballing. But yeah, no, I did exactly the same thing. I thought one cool thing to do with a video game would be if, like, the first level is the hit on the guy that he gets in trouble, that he gets poisoned for. So the first level takes place before he's had the poison injected, and that teaches you what the adrenaline meter looks like, and you're just sort of like, oh, that's interesting that you can hold.
I'm sure that won't come up later.
What just thinking it's similar to, like, the listening mechanic in The Last of Us, right? Just
Yeah,
like
sure.
a mechanic, and then from the second level onwards, it's like, no, you cannot stop now. And I think that is an interesting idea for a game where you cannot be idle and you have to continue keeping a meter up that is very quickly draining. But that's as far as I thought. As far for a Crank where he has to keep his adrenaline down, I thought you could call it something like uncranked.
Nice.
Or Crank unwounded, or something like that.
What
but I also thought.
The only other, looking at, what's the gimmick for Crank 3, that, like, the only one that I saw that I was like, was, that he is somehow, like, replaced with gears, and he needs to keep actually, like, cranking, like, winding up.
Yeah, but none of these... okay, here's why the concept for the Crank 1 is better than Crank 2, is that, like, as soon as you introduce something, it's just... this isn't that as interesting of a statement now that I'm saying it out loud, but, like... it's just not as cool. It's not as good of an idea that he has to electrocute himself. I think that adrenaline is something that, like, is inherently action, right? And so, like, none of the other ideas, I don't think... Because like, one road that I abandoned going down when trying to come up with an idea, but I'll go down now because I have to have an original idea, is, like, in the post-credit scene of Crank 2, he is, like, burnt alive, and they're trying to bring him back to life, and they put his heart back in, and he's, like, covered in bandages because he's burnt. And it's like, what if Crank 3 was just a man with, like, full covered skin burns, and it's like, now he has to keep his epidermis moist or else he'll die.
Yeah, he needs to stay
just,
wet.
Yeah, or it's just it's not even an action movie. It's like a Diving Bell and the Butterfly kind of. It's just like a real sad, like, movie about a burn victim. But like, I like the idea. What if it's that he's overheating, right? And he has to stay cool, and this means Chev Chalius is running across LA buck naked or something like that, or maybe he's, like, shitting and pissing everywhere, or I don't know. That's where I went as well. I think it'd be fun to see someone shitting and pissing their way through.
I love the idea, like, because I could see the room in which Crank is pitched, that some guy's like, I don't know, what if he's shitting and pissing everywhere?
Yeah, great. And you know what? That's probably the idea that Neville Dean / Taylor would like the most.
Yeah. So, alright, now it's time to rank that franchise, AJ. So over on letterboxd.com/cultpopture, you can find a list of all 197 franchises we've ranked we're getting close to 200 on this list, which maybe triggers a re-rank because that's what we've done.
That's a milestone.
Yeah. All right. So AJ, whereabouts are you thinking that this will go?
So we got to go below the Nymphomaniac constant, because I think this is largely like a rotten franchise. Maybe my feelings would be different in 2009 than in 2024, but at the same time, it's like, if I saw this for the first time as an adult, I don't know if I would even like be that into it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Do you think it's better or worse than 300?
What a great comparison. It is... Okay, it's more offensive than 300, but I think that I would rather watch these than 300
I'll
and
give you
300.
that. What about Big Fat Liar?
Yeah, it's better than Bigger Fatter Liar, I think. Is probably the worst.
Is it better than Jingle All the Way?
Just discussed. It is better than Jingle All the Way. It's very similar to Jingle. Hold on a second. Crank All the Way?
Is it better than The Butterfly Effect?
A very cranky Christmas. Okay. It is better
Christmas
than the
with the
Butterfly
Cranks.
Effect because...
Duh.
Hey, that's it. It is better than the Butterfly Effect.
Okay. Is it better than the 2019 Addams Family?
No. There we go. That's where it goes. Below.
Okay. Well, is it better than A Cinderella Story?
Yes.
Okay. It goes between The Addams Family and A Cinderella Story at 171.
Beautiful stuff. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We've got one more exciting segment now, which is where we decide what the next duology we will be covering is. I believe we're up to it. We're doing a franchise roulette, and I believe you have to make me guess like a little dancing monkey this week, Richard.
I do. I completely forgot that we were doing this, so I have dropped my phone, and now I also need to find the franchise list.
God, it's lucky you've got poison eking through your veins. All this adrenaline, it's keeping you alive, probably.
Wow.
What about Crank 3? He can't go on his phone.
Wow, yeah, I think for like millennials. All right.
Crank 3, he has to do a TikTok dance or 84. He'll die. Like, just...
84, all right. 84. Oh, okay. Interesting.
On the scale of Crank
it's a two-film
to Rio,
franchise.
where... Of course. I should hope so.
It's a lot closer to Rio.
Okay, is it an animated film?
It is an animated film series.
Is it for children?
Yeah, it's for children.
Is it Nomeo and Juliet / Sherlock Gnomes?
Not Nomeo and Juliet / Sherlock Gnomes.
Damn. I give up.
It's a Pixar franchise.
Possibly. Okay. Is it Incredibles?
That is Incredibles. That's
fun. Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
We're so miserable. Like, what are we going to land on next? It's like, hey, that one's fine. That one's all good. Like, of the Pixar duologies, it's probably the best one. How many duologies are there? There's soon to be 4, I believe.
Finding Nemo, Finding Dory, Inside Out.
Monsters.
Oh, yeah.
We've done Monsters, Inc. and Monsters University. Incredibles, The Incredibles, and Incredibles 2, I believe, dropping the.
Yes.
We'll be back in 2 weeks to cover those movies. So this is a good... People should watch along. When was the last time you watched Incredibles? Like, this is an old school cult popture watch along episode, I think. No one needed to watch Rio and Rio 2 with us. No one needed to watch Crank and Crank High Voltage with us. But Incredibles, I think, is fun for the whole family.
Should we reach out to Spencer Fox, the voice of Dash from the first film, who was also the guitarist in one of my favourite bands at the moment?
Why not, Richard? It sounds like the obvious move to make, considering this culmination of events. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. If you enjoyed this, please support us on all the places like Twitter and Instagram at Cole Popture. You can also jump in our Discord and tell us why you actually think the Crank series is misunderstood and not actually that problematic. I can't wait to hear that defense. And you can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Popture, where if you donate $5 or more, you get to participate in something called the post-credit sequence, which just like in Crank has post-credit sequences, and it's coming at you just just after this music ends. Thank you for joining us, Richard. Ka kite anō.
Crank that soulja boy.
Welcome along to the post-credit scene. There's a segment at the end of each episode where if you donate $5 or more over at patreon.com/cultpopshow, you get to give us something to talk about in this, the post-credit scene. Richard, who's it from and what is it?
Today's episode comes to, post-credit scene question, comes to us from Joe Rundle, who says, if you could turn a chain restaurant into a movie franchise, what would it be, and can you do a quick pitch for the franchise that you have just created?
Wow. Okay, you go first.
Well, I think you would set up a cinematic universe here, right? Like, you would have Wendy,
right,
you would have the Burger King, you would have Pizza the Hut, Domino's, the Colonel, Ronald McDonald.
Like, Ronald McDonald is actually no longer a McDonald's mascot as well. It's the Ronald McDonald house mascot. So there's an interesting story there. A man out of time, you know? Like a man displaced. He was created to sell fast food, and somehow he's wound up in children's charity. So, like, that's an interesting character arc right there. That's almost an opposite Walter White arc. You know, starts out making poison that's responsible for millions of deaths worldwide, and then ends up being like a symbol of goodwill.
Yeah, I would put mine is going to be a Wendy's film, and it's going to be a sort of a cross between Oppenheimer and the Bart Gets Famous episode of The Simpsons. So Wendy's was kind of known for being like the first corporate social media account that was like fun and, you know, would talk like a real person, did memes and stuff. And now every single corporate account in the world is trying to do that. Every now and then I will get some fucking...
This is Oppenheimer-esque.
Yeah, some fucking, like, piece of shit TikTok account for some local business, and they'll be like... It'll be a TikTok being like, hey, I'm way in over my head, please like this, so that my boss thinks I did a good job. And it's like, they've clearly gone to their boss and been like, this is the trend, this is so funny. And then, so, you know, some pottery place has a huge TikTok.
Yeah. The best is when it's like the Prime Minister of New Zealand is doing cringy TikTok gags on the official account. Yeah.
I want to do a Wendy's film about, you know, the what the price of her invention is.
Nice.
Also, join us in 2 weeks' time for, get this, AJ, the 400th episode of the Cult Pop Show podcast.
Wow, what number is that based on? Because there's a couple of grey areas I know in our
400
episode list.
There have been 400 individual
pieces
files
of audio uploaded to our.
Yeah. I think that let me just double check. That counts. Scooby-Doo and Barbie is 1, but Back to the Future is 3.
Love this logic.
Yeah.